Welcome to Killer Psychologist. I'm Dana Anderson, a forensic psychologist and your host of the show. Killer Psychologist is for true crime fanatics and anyone intrigued with the dark side of psychology. World Wrestling Entertainment founder Vince McMahon is accused of rape and sex trafficking in a lawsuit filed by Janel Grant. Today on Killer Psychologist, we're going to talk about this lawsuit, which is a civil case, and we're going to discuss why cases like this are not filed as a criminal case first, and what some potential criminal charges might arise out of this. And let's talk about these individuals involved in this suit. Of course, these are all allegations. This is a suit. Dr. Craig Wetterer is with me here today. We both have a copy of this 67-page document that was filed in the District Court of Connecticut. And it is graphic. It is explicit sexual content that describes the abuse that Janel Grant suffered. Unless you've come across this document and you see what's contained in it, you probably would have no idea. But it is quite astounding. We're going to talk about our role as forensic psychologists, where we come in to cases like this. And I know oftentimes the role of a forensic psychologist is misunderstood, but I definitely advocate for consulting with a forensic psychologist as early as feasible in cases like this. And I'm sure that Janel is going to be evaluated by a psychologist.
Yes. So, you're referring to the alleged victim in this case who has filed civil suit against Mr. McMahon, making these allegations. In many cases, particularly if the complaint alleges in the damage award section, they're looking for, emotional distress damages. They're looking for any sort of psychological impacts. And with these kinds of cases, generally attorneys are going to put those emotional damage claims in there as well, because those, can certainly lead to significant awards if they're substantiated. So the way that we would come in that role would be performing a complete, full comprehensive psychological evaluation of this victim or plaintiff in this case. And generally that's going to be done. The defense is going to want that done, right? And in some cases, perhaps even the plaintiff's attorney is going to want that done as well, because they're looking to establish, what's the consequence of these acts, of these alleged acts on the plaintiff in terms of her psychological well-being. So that would be just like any other evaluation. We would do a full intake interview. We'd review collateral records. We would look for baseline functioning. We would look to see, how was she functioning prior to all of this happening? In other words, did she have pre-existing psychological conditions that predated these alleged acts? Because those are going to come into play, right? Because if, for example, if she's already suffering from PTSD from some other trauma or other things that have happened to her, then those have to be looked at. And we have to try to figure out and tease out what's caused by these alleged acts and what was pre-existing. So that would be kind of that one of those questions that we oftentimes are asked to answer. And sometimes it's hard to get at that, right? Because things become entangled, where you've got this entanglement of symptoms that are, some of it could have been pre-existing, but then some of it is also driven by the additional traumatic stressors that have happened, right? So how do you unpack that, untangle it? So that's kind of that's one of the questions that we oftentimes have to answer, and we do that with a very comprehensive evaluation. And you've done several of those, and I've done several of those as well. They take a bit of time, right? Because we have to look at pre-morbid functioning. We have to see how is this person functioning prior to these alleged acts, and then now post. How are they functioning now, and what's changed, if anything, in terms of their functional impairments and how they've been impacted psychologically?
One of the things I wanted to mention is that victims, and in this case, she is a plaintiff, but assuming her claims are valid and these things did happen. When a person comes forward in cases like this and they subject themselves to a psychological evaluation, everything comes out. And so it's so difficult for people to be in this situation. If you can imagine your entire mental health history on trial, every medication maybe you ever took, every complaint you ever filed, every job you ever got fired from, every ex that has something negative to say about you, I'm telling you, it's brutal. That is a huge deterrent for people filing these cases. Can you just put yourself in her situation for a moment and imagine the scrutiny that she's going to be faced with? Psychological damages during the abuse, right? But now I'm telling you, the legal process can be cruel. I do work on cases like this, and it's a whole nother layer of trauma just to be in a deposition graphically explaining things that happen to you with people looking at you through this magnifying lens, recording you, interrupting you, interjecting. So I just want to frame that because a lot of people can be quick to make claims, say disparaging statements for people that file these lawsuits, but I'm telling you, it takes a lot to put yourself out there. I certainly wouldn't ever want to be in that position. And it's embarrassing. And I can't even imagine just all your personal information. And this is sexually explicit content. So everything is out there.
And this is one of the reasons why, and I can cross over and talk about on the criminal side of this, because often, when these civil complaints get filed, that can often trigger a criminal investigation as well. And here's the reality: a majority of sexual assault victims actually don't come forward. So we don't hear about this. This is the reason why sexual violence is underreported, dramatically underreported, because, and that's precisely what you're saying, is that many victims do not want that scrutiny. They don't want to be put in the public eye. Like you said, everything is dissected about their life when they're during the investigation and even during a trial, if it comes to a jury trial, for example. Now, there are statutes in effect that do protect the victims of sexual violence. For example, they can elect to remain anonymous. In other words, they have their name redacted from the formal investigation, the formal report. So, and that depends on the state as well. So, in California, there are protections for victims of domestic violence, for example, where they can elect to not reveal their identity in the official reports. And this, again, does offer a layer of protection initially from, again, when discovery happens, these reports can get out, they can get circulated to some degree. But once they're in court, that identity then, is no longer, the protections are no longer there because, as the defense, they have the right to confront and cross-examine and their accusers. And so that's a due process right. So at some point they do have to, the identity has to be revealed if a case like this, for example, goes to trial. She's choosing to disclose her identity. What I was going to say is he's got multiple lawsuits filed against him right now. So there is one case, there is a Jane Doe plaintiff case right now yes. And that's an example of that, where the victim in this case is electing to protect her identity at least in the initial stages of the complaint.
Yeah, I would want to not be known. I would want to be anonymous. She's already known. She's a celebrity in her own right. She's already well known in the media through the world wrestling entertainment. She is making a public statement. I listened to a statement from her attorney this morning, and her attorney mentioned trauma bonding and that she felt caged and imprisoned and that she was groomed and that over time these degrading acts escalated. And when we think about going to court and the role of a forensic psychologist, a lot of times we might be asked to describe what grooming looks like and maybe how their relationship began, how it was initiated, under what circumstances, and how this relationship unfolded. And from what I understand, at the time when they were introduced, I believe her family died. I think it was her parents. So she was extremely vulnerable emotionally. She didn't have a lot of funds. Somebody reached out to Vince to see if they could help her financially or with employment, and then made the introduction. And so those are things that can be talked about during the trial of how the relationship initiated and under what terms, how it crossed over to being a sexual relationship.
Yeah, that's, and again, we're talking about the allegations here. There's these allegations that there was some type of grooming that was going on, in terms of getting her to engage in some of these acts. And we can certainly talk about the sort of the psychological dimensions of abusers. In other words, of either, sexual predators and those that are at risk of enacting sexual violence or using, power control dynamics to manipulate people. And let's just get this out there. The majority of these cases are generally men, right, that are doing this. It doesn't necessarily mean that women can't be abusers, that there's certainly cases where that happens. It's just, we don't see it as often in the official reports, but also just in the, in the research literature on this. Generally, men tend to be the primary enactors of sexual violence in most cases. And there's some personality dynamics that we can talk about that, listeners might be interested in knowing more about, because this could, protect you in the future against getting into a relationship with someone who has some of these warning signs. So we can go there too, talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of platforms like OnlyFans and others, dating apps, just that opens up these relationships, if you will. And there always is a play of power, and they are transactional in nature. There is an exchange of money. And I've heard many stories, but over time, the requests that is asked of them, they're pushed further and further past their boundaries of what they were willing to do. They're now being asked to do really degrading performances. And I've listened to some of their stories, and they say why they continue to do it. A lot of times it's about finances. They're in that position. Obviously, if we were in a position of power, we probably wouldn't be doing that. Okay.
Yeah, this is the quid pro quo, paradigm where, like in these allegations with Mr. McMahon, Ms. Grant was sort of in a vulnerable position, right, when they first met. And so the power differential is huge, obviously, here, right? She's someone who doesn't have resources. She's not, she's looking for work, essentially. She's struggling a little bit. And, he takes her under his wings and, begins to, hires her basically, right? And then, of course, what happens? The grooming starts, the manipulation starts, allegedly, right? And then ultimately this turns sexual, and then it becomes, this for that, demanding things. If you don't do these things, you're going to get cut off, essentially, or, some other threats generally are made. A lot of times they're economic in nature. So there's that piece that's involved. And again, so this goes into personality dynamics as well. Who are the people that are at risk for doing this kind of stuff? And again, this goes into the personality stuff that I have an interest in, that I've done research in, that have looked at sexual aggression, and who are the individuals that are highest at risk for enacting both sexual harassment, but also sexual aggression and sexual violence. And I can speak to that if we want to go down that path.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the other side, as forensic psychologists, we can be called to evaluate the perpetrator or the criminal or the defendant in cases like this. Now, I have a question for you. Now, typically, defendants in this case, they're not going to want to be evaluated. It would have to be that his attorneys or he raises his mental state as being an excuse or something. Then you could call in a psychologist to evaluate him. But he's not, I would go say, not going to do that. I wouldn't. No. I personally, in doing those evals, and on a side note, I did get recently assigned a civil case that is comparable to this, where it's a sadistic sexual acts are occurring, but it hasn't made its way into criminal court yet. But will I ever get to evaluate that person, right? The defendant? Well, that'll be interesting if I were to be able to. And we can also talk about some of our approach to interviewing people like that and the test we give them. But on another case I'm working on, the guy never showed up to be interviewed or the deposition or anything. I mean, they're gone. And there's not a lot of motivation for them to show up. Okay. So also on one deposition in a civil case, the guy is talking about all this criminal stuff he's doing. Criminal charges will be brought about. Some of these defendants aren't that smart, or I'm not sure why their attorneys aren't objecting, but I've had people ask me, why is this case a civil case? And I'm like, well, that's where we're at right now, but stay tuned.
They can start as civil cases, like in this case, and then with Mr. McMahon, we now know that there's federal investigation going on. It looks like Homeland Security is I guess they're tasked now with doing these investigations that involve allegations of sex trafficking, and that usually involves when we're seeing victims being moved across, state lines and things like that. That's when the feds can get involved. When there's federal questions that they can then pull in and be involved, but. Here's the reason why, in a lot of times, even the civil cases that get filed, criminal charges don't get filed. And there's there's many reasons, but one of the primary reasons is the burden of proof. So in particularly in one victim, one perpetrator cases where it's an allegation of rape, for example, oftentimes it is he said, she said, right? You may not have corroborative evidence, even though you have physical evidence. The issue of consent is always what is at play in a lot of these cases involving rape or sexual battery or these other allegations that can become criminal. And so people have to remember that prosecutors, they're looking at these cases on a beyond a reasonable doubt standard, meaning, this is that's the highest, burden, right? We have different evidentiary burdens of proof. And beyond a reasonable doubt is very, very high. We're in the high 90%, 97, 98% probability, if you want to think about it that way. Whereas in a civil case, preponderance is the standard generally in most jurisdictions. There's preponderance, there's clear and convincing, and then there's beyond a reasonable doubt. Those are the three sort of evidentiary burdens. Now, like in this case here, I assume it's going to be a preponderance standard. Preponderance is just more likely than not. Right. And that's how it's framed. So in other words, to get over that hurdle of sort of proving, right, you just have to prove that it's more likely than not that these acts that are being alleged actually did occur. And that's a much easier hurdle to get over.
Yeah. I was just thinking about this case, if it ever went to trial, which I think most cases don't make it to trial. And I'm sure there would be attorneys advising the defendant in this case reasons why this might not be there. Typically these cases settle, but you can imagine if it did go to trial, how public this would be and how graphic it would be. And I know we all listened to Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial, and the fecal matter found in Johnny Depp's bed, like that. That is seared in my head forever.
Well, that can change your sort of your idealized perceptions of people when you see the realities of what goes on, right, in behind closed doors, so to speak. So again, this is a reason why in this case, and I was looking at some of the recent stories around this, and it looks like, McMahon's attorneys are trying to, they filed some motions. They're trying to compel arbitration. In other words, they just want to resolve this matter. Now, again, if I was the defense attorney in a case like this, I would probably be doing the same thing. I'd be either, if I can't get it dismissed on a motion for summary judgment motion, which is a motion that generally is done after discovery is completed, although discovery can still be ongoing when you file this. But if assuming that wasn't successful, then we'd be looking to try to settle this, right? We would want to go to jury trial on something like this with such a high profile defendant. But that doesn't mean it's going to settle through either arbitration or through settlement conference of sorts. That's how you're right. Most cases do settle. Overwhelming majority of cases, civil and criminal, actually do settle without going to a full trial. But sometimes in high profile cases like this, the plaintiff wants to push it. If they get past these burdens, in other words, the summary judgment burden, which is the one hurdle you have to get through if you're a plaintiff, because you can expect the defense is going to file that, right? They're going to try to get the lawsuit dismissed at some point during these stages, pretrial stages. There's mechanisms for doing that. I expect them to try to settle this out, but you never know. The Heard Depp trial didn't get settled out, did it? That one went to a full jury trial where we got to see all the explicit things that have traumatized you to some extent.
Yeah. Well, and on one side, you might think, say, Amber Heard might have had reasons to wanting it to be publicized, but then it goes very differently. I think it went differently in her mind. I think take the advice of your attorneys and having a forensic psychologist give some insight into these cases of also what's best for the victim or the plaintiff. Because compensation, while that's what will be received in the end in a civil case, like assuming it's successful, you can't erase the humiliation or the shame if this becomes so public. Now, keep in mind, the graphic descriptions are, him defecating on her, like running down her while he's, having sex with someone else in front of her. So the graphic nature of this is, it's X-rated, and there's a lot of shame and of horrific, degrading sexual acts that are sadistic in nature that I'm not even sure how they could screen this to show this on television, to talk about this.
Yeah, they wouldn't. Well, I can speak to the media is reporting on some of these graphic, elements of these allegations. You can go online and you can see they are summarizing. They're obviously we're not showing photos or video or anything like that. So but you're correct. It's something like this. These are central to the plaintiff's allegations of this degradation that she encountered. No, so when it gets to the issue of damages and the issue of psychologic harm, these are central issues that they are going to come out at a trial. They will absolutely come out at a trial, and that's you're right. The plaintiff or the victim in this case is needs to understand that there could be additional traumatic impacts from being subjected to this at trial, because you cannot, as a plaintiff or as a victim, you can't completely conceal yourself or protect yourself from having that exposure when we go to trial. Because the defendant has that right, they have a right, they have a due process right to confront, and that means the cross-examination is done by the attorney, their counsel, but the victim is not necessarily going to be sheltered if something like this goes to trial, and that can be very traumatic in and of itself.
Yeah, and defense counsel isn't going to take it light on you at all. So you do need to have some psychological prep involved, and I would recommend whether I've advised clients I've evaluated to be engaged with a therapist and prepare themselves, like mentally, emotionally, psychologically, just taking care of themselves, because they can have a breakdown, become so more impaired where they can't leave the house. They can't trust anyone. They don't want to answer their phone. It's so overwhelming. And I, well, my job is not, I don't do therapy. I just do their initial assessment, but it's kind of horrific to see their psychological decline. That's sadistic in itself, because the opposing counsel knows like how horrific this is. It's almost like just wait till they drop out of the race. They just give up and stop, because these could go on for years. And some people are so emotionally depleted and drained and exhausted. And do keep in mind they're financially weary as well. If they already had not much and everything's riding on this, it can almost wipe someone away financially, right? So now they're hanging on that thread to just see it through, just to be compensated.
A very, very, we both been in depositions, right? We both, I've given deposition testimony, but I've taken depositions. I've done this type of stuff. And yes, it's extremely taxing, even if you're not involved in a case where, these sort of explicit, graphic sexual acts are happening, these degrading things that are very humiliating are happening to someone. And it's stressful, it's like stressful when in testifying, it's stressful. It's, I've even, we're on the stand, that can be traumatic. So think about being, being a victim of something like this. It's very, very difficult. In some cases, victims, like you said, they literally break down and they can't do it. They can't testify. They can't emotionally and psychologically, they cannot do it. And that becomes a big problem. It can become a big challenge for, the court in having to address this, because again, this is the process involves confrontation. It's an adversarial process, right? This is how we get to the truth, or we're supposed to be able to get to the truth, is to have this vigorous adversarial sort of jostling going back and forth between plaintiff, defense, counsel, and all of that. So, yeah, you can expect to be, attacked in a figurative sense on your character, your credibility, all of that stuff, even a victim. And even, attorneys are supposed to know that, look, if this is a sexual assault victim or the allegations involve, sexual violence against a victim, that they need to be sensitive to that and understand that these acts, if substantiated, they can lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms in people, which can reappear, when they're on the stand testifying and things like that, and they need to be aware of that. But and obviously the courts have to monitor this as well. So the judge is in charge of making sure that if this victim is starting to fall apart, they're going to take a break, they're going to take a recess, and they'll reconvene perhaps on a later day or something. But yeah, those are, and again, this is the reason why most of these cases, and a lot of them don't even come to the light of any sort of legal proceeding, because again, victims are they feel so ashamed, right? They feel like they're responsible in some way. We could talk about the personality elements of that, of sort of dependent personalities, and how some personality styles amend themselves to getting into these relationships where you end up becoming degraded, objectified, manipulated, and you are used essentially, right? And it's difficult, absolutely difficult for people to sometimes to even come forward and to report this, because sometimes they internalize this as it's their fault in some way. They blame themselves, and so they end up not even reporting to anybody. They maybe don't even tell their closest friends, family members.
Yeah, it's true. This happens. Sexual assault and abuse happens far more than people know. And I've heard many stories from across settings, and they are not reporting it. I'm telling you that I have, and I could tell you the reasons why, but I always encourage people to report, and I provide a safe space to make the report for them or assist them. I offer it every time. And my role with people in crisis, like within the psychiatric hospital, a lot of times there's a lot of other things going on in their life that they haven't reported. And then I see people in jail. They've been sexually abused on the street, homelessness. This happens all the time. And I interviewed, I think, 38 people last year as part of a lawsuit regarding Boy Scouts, but only a few of them reported it. So the numbers are high, but we're not accurately reflecting it. And I have a theory, and you can let me know what you think about this, but I do see men in custody most of the time, and they also have sexual abuse, whether it's a man or a woman, but they definitely aren't telling. I offer to report it. I am telling you. So I think the number is underreported across the board, but I think we're not even catching the numbers that are happening to men. But the point is this: these people are still out there, these predator types. And through my interviews with people, I always ask them something meaningful I can take away. Like, what could I share with people in the future to help them? What could someone have said to you that could have helped you want to report it? Or what would you have want to know? Like, what can I do? How can I be a voice for you? So I always ask them something like that so they can feel like there was value in them reporting to me. I can advocate for them somehow.
Obviously, support is critical, right? So if they feel supported, there's going to be an increased likelihood that they'll be willing to come forward and report. And again, part of that, again, is the issue of being believed is, I think, a big piece of why a lot of victims will withhold reporting, is that they suspect that they will not be heard. In other words, or they'll be challenged, or they won't be believed, and they'll be ridiculed, or all of these things. And so it's that fear, right, that you're not going to be believed, that leads to, I think, the underreporting that we see. We know from the research literature that all of these statistics are significantly underreported. And when it comes to child abuse, child sexual abuse, this is very, very underreported for a number of reasons. Again, the issues of shame, not being believed, also the fear, right, that the threats oftentimes that the predator will make, that, if you tell your parents, if you tell the police about this, I will do these things to your family or whatever, right? So a lot of that manipulation going on across the board. So that leads to, fear, and a lot of times non-reporting. I think we should talk. I don't know if you want to speak to some of the I call it the personological, the personality pieces that drive a lot of this sort of sexual harassment, but also enactment of sexual violence. We know that there's a construct that does a pretty good job of explaining this, and a lot of people probably are not familiar with it. It's actually related to the more recent term of toxic masculinity. If I'm sure that's something that people hear about today, right? The whole toxic masculinity, but it actually started a lot much earlier than that in terms of the research literature, the way we research this. And I've done original research that has looked at this as well.
Yeah. The three facets of hypermasculinity, the traits of men who glorify and objectify women. So let's talk about those, because watch out for those. And these are the types of men that are going to be involved in sexual crimes where you are going to be objectified.
I'll speak to the research that I did using just as an overview. Hypermasculinity is a construct that was proposed back in the mid 1980s by a couple of researchers, and there's three facets to this. There is having the people that are high in this construct, and generally it's men, but it can be women, but generally it's men. They have callous sexual attitudes towards women. They have a belief that violence is in some way manly. In other words, violence is equated to the being a man, and then the experience of danger as exciting. So when we see these three together, or when you see somebody who displays some of these traits, or all three of them actually, you probably are in front of someone who is going to be very high in hypermasculinity, and we can actually measure this with a scale called the Hypermasculinity Inventory. It's a scale I used in the research I did back in, the early 2000s. And I was looking at this in law enforcement cohort. In other words, how does this operate in law enforcement? Just because the assumption would be that you're going to likely have men, particularly, that are going to be more likely to be hypermasculine in the field. And what I found is that the number one predictor of sexual harassment, enactment of sexual harassment and sexual violence, was hypermasculinity. So it is a predictor of. And it doesn't necessarily mean that everybody that's high in this are going to be sexual predators. That's not true. But if you are high in this, there is a higher likelihood you're going to be that type of person that's going to be, telling offensive jokes in the workplace, objectifying women, dehumanizing women, making jokes, things like that, engaging in inappropriate touching or conduct with women or men, right? It doesn't have to be only women. So, watch out for guys, when you got guys that are displaying all of this, all of these three components, you got someone that's probably high in hypermasculinity.
Yeah. And be careful, because as a female, you like a man's man, but not this, right? I mean, I want a man, like a masculine. Okay. But what do you think about the term alpha male? Because a lot of people, I don't think they truly know what it means, but people throw around terms and they create their own definition, but you should probably know what the word means before you describe yourself as such. But it's commonly a thing, and it may not mean what you think it means, but what I've seen with these hyper-masculine men and a lot of men that I've interviewed that were sexual predators, they were also abused as sexually molested. And so one of the responses that some have told me that they acted out overly aggressive and over masculine because they didn't want anyone to know they had been victimized, or they were vulnerable, or they were shamed, and they were embarrassed that it happened. A man did it to them. So they were they acted out against women. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a common defense sort of mechanism. In psychodynamic terms, you call that sort of reaction formation. So, it's a defense against, if you're abused by a man and you're a man. So when you're a child, there's a threat to masculinity. There's a threat to your identity in terms of heterosexuality, if that's how you are or see yourself. And so a lot of times what you do see that outward, projection back out, meaning this outward sort of, I've got to make sure everybody knows that I am a man's man. I am super masculine, because again, it's a defense. They're that inner vulnerability, that fear somebody might find out that they were raped, right, or they were sexually assaulted in some way when they were very young. If they don't deal with that, right, if, in other words, they don't get therapy generally and process that. That stuff will linger, right? And it can result in just this sort of overreaction. And it can also be, in the form of abuse, of carrying on abuse of others when you're older. So we do see a lot of our sexual predators, they do have abuse histories. They do have, early child sexual abuse. And so clearly that does correspond to later behaviors, later enactments of sexual violence against others.
I don't know if you recently came out with this, but I watched it on an interview. It was Mike Tyson shared that he was abused sexually. And I think it was more recent because I don't remember ever hearing him disclose that, but he was tearful and he felt shamed and he wanted to stop the interview. And he said it really messed him up because he was a kid. I think he was just out minding his business and someone, he didn't share the details, whether they abduct.
Right. There's different levels of sexual abuse, right? Obviously the most invasive would be, being raped. But a lot of it's just fondling, it's inappropriate touching, it's, those sorts of things. Could be in oral copulation. There's varying types of, sexual abuse that can happen, obviously. Then, some could argue that they're all equally damaging, but I would say that there's certainly some types that are far more invasive and can be more damaging to somebody's internal framework in terms of how they view themselves, right? When you've been victimized like that. So, and again, Mike Tyson being a boxer now, he's in this really sort of kind of masculine kind of role, right? So again, you see reactions sometimes in people that they develop. It's kind of like a shell, right? It's an outward projection. It's a mask, so to speak, that they don't want people to see that internal shame, that internal vulnerability.
Yeah, and most people I've interviewed, they don't even tell their spouse, even during a civil suit. In fact, they're concealing the phone calls. Like if they're awarded a large sum of money, they won't know where it came from. I'm telling you, because I've had cases they've said, no, I'm telling no one. And so during the lawsuit, the plaintiff is having these secret phone calls and their partner won't know. Their partner probably thinks they're doing something else and is going to wonder where they got all this money. But I'm telling you, people that have been married 30 years, how do you go through this whole lawsuit without telling your partner? But I'm telling you, this is how secretive it is.
Yeah, that goes right to the shame. It goes right to the, when people feel a lot of shame, they're going to conceal oftentimes, right? They're going to repress. These are all sort of psychodynamic things that are happening. Lots of defense mechanisms are going to be operating here to protect the psyche, right? Against these overwhelmingly negative sort of emotional experiences. And this is why severe traumas can lead to, in rare cases, people to develop dissociation, identity disorder, although extremely rare, right? But we have seen it, right? In cases where there's, severe trauma.
I have. Yeah. And that's where severe abuse, chronic abuse over time, or just unresolved, it can play on repeat through their mind, and they can start to just having that go through their head for years and years, over decades. They could just start to disconnect from reality and just feel like the abuse is still happening, or they're still at threat, or they're still paranoid, or they start to disassociate and disconnect, distrust. It can cause all kinds of problems in civil suits where you're evaluating their mental health. I don't think people understand it doesn't just nicely transfer into post-traumatic stress disorder. It's messy. It affects their health. There's cancer. There's gastrointestinal problems. There's
psychosomatic, there's a lot of what we call somatization problems going on. Again, where they're repressing all this stuff. They're not dealing with it. What happens is they start having GI problems. They start having neurologic complaints. They start having, they're developing all these regional pain problems and all these things going on. And the doctors are saying, we can't find out, there's no medical cause for this. Right. Because it's all psychological, or many times it is.
Yeah. So it's complicated. So I would say Well, if anyone sees me for any reason, I always like make sure they, besides the psychological evaluation, I refer them to a medical doctor to get medically evaluated because your body, you need to get yourself evaluated too physically, get your labs run. And just so people know, yeah, you can get a psych eval, but you're definitely going to get a medical evaluation, or I'll refer you to a psychiatrist as well, or maybe a neurologist, or maybe other specialists. But I'm telling you, you'll find all these things going on, and it starts to make sense why they've been suffering, and it's complicated. So don't just settle early on in your case and say, oh, I have PTSD or I was depressed, right? No, go to the doctor, get a full eval. You don't even know what you don't know about your body. A lot of these people are so out of touch with the physiological symptoms happening. They've gotten used to, right?
Yeah.
All
they
this.
they just adopt it. Yeah.
Well, like, this is normal.
It's normal to them now, but the way they cope with it oftentimes is maladaptive. They start using substances to try to cope. So they're either, whether that's alcohol, pills, or, whatever it is, they're using substances to cope. And that's not necessarily adaptive either. So obviously a good takeaway here is that it's important that anyone who is a victim of any kind of sexual violence, they really do need to, they should be seeing a mental health therapist. It doesn't have to be a psychologist, but they really should get evaluated, right, to figure out what's going on. Because, if it is PTSD, then we need to know that, because we treat PTSD a little bit differently than, say, we would treat major depression or other mood disorders. So knowing what is going on is important first. And so that you need to see a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, right? Because we're the ones that are doing that testing. If that needs to be done, it should be done oftentimes, because then you clarify, well, what's the best treatment? Because if I know that it's PTSD, then I'm going to recommend, a course of, whether it's cognitive processing or EMDR, or some of the newer things, or even now with some of these emerging treatments like even ketamine. We're looking at ketamine now for potentially targeting PTSD. It's not approved by the FDA yet for that, but also MDMA. MDMA is there's some trials that are, I believe they're in phase 3. In fact, one of my students just did a presentation on this. One of my TA in our psychopharmacology class last week, she did a great presentation on the emerging treatment and using MDMA in treating PTSD. And this is MDA-assisted psychotherapy, and it's profoundly effective, or at least the tentative data suggests that it's very effective at reducing post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, right? So, hey, if we need to know what's going on first, so that we can figure out what's the best treatment approach.
Yeah, and the treatment recommendations can be made by the forensic psychologist in the legal case, because they're also assessing how long treatment will take, how much will it cost, like the severity of it. And regarding ketamine treatment, I had a client, I saw her before she had it and during and after. So I documented her journey for like 6 months, and I was amazed. The effects were profound. It helped her PTSD in ways I could have never imagined. And it was definitely measurable, because I was like a study. I was measuring it each week, her symptoms, and I'm very, very specific. So all of that being said, is if you think you have PTSD, don't just assume you do. Get actually properly evaluated to see what diagnosis you may have, and then get the right treatment, because the whole point would be to get the right treatment, right?
Yeah. I mean, if it's a somatization disorder, we're going to look at that a little bit differently than we would PTSD, or if it's major depression, right? We're going to, as far as psychotherapy goes, but also on the medication side, if we're going to recommend pharmacotherapy, which oftentimes we do, if it's PTSD, then there's 2 SSRIs that are FDA approved for the treatment of PTSD, which is sertraline and paroxetine. But there's other medications that can also be helpful as well, that don't necessarily, they're not FDA approved, but they can be prescribed off label. So that's why we need to, the more we know about what's going on, the better we can tailor, if we're doing an assessment, we can better tailor those treatment recommendations for the most effective evidence-based treatment for the condition.
If you're going to go through any civil process like this, I would say it's well worth your time to invest in getting a forensic psychologist and get properly evaluated, right? Not just for, monetary damages, but so actually getting the right diagnosis, the right treatment plan, the right meds, like to actually get better. Because once the lawsuit ends, all the money in the world won't save you. Like you have to live after that and life goes on. Like when it's over, like psychologically, emotionally, like everything you've gone through. So it's really important to take care of yourself leading up to it and during and after. And I really encourage people to, if you have no money and you have no medical benefits, you can still make your report, even without a report, but crime victim assistance through the district attorney's office. You can, if you're a direct victim of a crime, you could get 40 sessions of therapy. There's a bunch of services they offer you that I could go on about, but you have access to those. I've helped many people get them. And in any event, if later down the line you decide to pursue a case, you have this history that you've received services, you've documented it, and maybe it didn't go through criminal court, but you have documentation that the problem existed, or you made this report, or you were getting treatment for it, or it was approved through crime victim assistance. So it's never too late to start the process ever. And the sooner you do, I will tell you in my experience, the most successful individuals have sought out treatment and it really helped them, and they're able to talk about it. They're able to help others. They have a voice. There's not so much secrecy. And it's been like the weight is lifted off them. They're able to heal in their life. On the other end, I will tell you the horror stories of people on their deathbed or the end of life or in the hospital, like so bitter and angry. And sometimes they're involved in the civil suit too, right? Okay.
Oh, yeah.
They've just waited so long that.
Yeah, the damage is done. Yeah, you're right. I mean, it's like, psychological damage, like, unresolved trauma, repeated complex trauma, chronic trauma is bad for your body. It is bad for your immune system. We know that it can lead to, it really, really messes with the immune system. Your immunity drops. You're more susceptible to develop cancers. We know this from the research literature. It's pretty clear. So the earlier you can get treatment and begin to heal, the better you're going to be overall, both emotionally, psychologically, but physically as well.
Yeah. So Janel Grant, she's going to be going through this, and I'm sure I would invite her if she wants to be on the show or talk about it. Her statement was that she wants to help other victims, and it was also helping her get her voice back by doing this. And so you do have to have a mindset, if just assume maybe nothing happens of the case, you lose or you don't get any money, go through the mindset that you're actually doing it for other reasons too, for healing or to help others, so that you psychologically there is some healing through this, because it's such an arduous process. And anyway, I don't know if the government has time between Puff Daddy and
they're pretty busy right now. I think he's got a federal, the feds are investigating him too. So they're pretty busy right now with all of these cases. We'll see if charges get filed, right? So nobody's, everyone's innocent until they've been proven guilty, right, in a court.
Yeah. So some people are just going down. We've seen that with Epstein. Where's Epstein now? Well, He was found hanging from a bed sheet in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in New York City. Where's it going to go with Sean Combs? Well, that is to be determined. So the interesting part about a lot of these cases is that this racketeering or other illegal activities disguised as business deal. There's a lot going on there. So a lot to unpack. There's a lot of suits. It'll be interesting to see how this case goes, but is there a shift? Are we going to be seeing more people exposed in cases like this? Is this?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think this started with the Me Too movement, right? And I think it's definitely picking up. It's empowering. Well, and again, most of the victims in these cases are women. So, but I always want to qualify that it's not always women that are the victims, but the majority of them are. And yeah, I think that there's been an empowerment, right, to some degree, so that they're less concerned about some of the potential fallout maybe than before because of all the support that they're seeing these other women that are coming forward are getting. And so I think that is empowering, and that is probably what is contributing to why we're seeing a lot more of these cases now. These have always been going on, right? This stuff has been happening, for millennia. It's just that I think now, because of awareness and because of some of these movements, these social movements, now we're starting to see women coming forward, right? They're coming forward and actually reporting. And that's a good thing, right? Because, and again, it's assuming that the allegations have merit and they're supported and they're able to prove them, then yes, they should be. They should be compensated for the damages, if they're able to prove those in court.
Yeah, Janel Grant's attorney said that she hopes that the doors of secrecy will be blown off. So, all right, to summarize this up here, the warning signs, like if these men could wear a warning label, like with the t-shirt, those 3 things to look out for. Let's go over those again.
Yeah,
so
let's
ladies,
go over those. So,
ladies, this is for you. And this is specific to look out for. So red flags are there for you to not just run over. They mean something. Don't ignore them. You don't have to get involved in any of these with these types of people. When you see the signs, you can leave early on or don't engage, like get out, run. So Dr. Wetter, close us out with these 3 facets of hypermasculinity.
Sure. Those are so again, if your boyfriend or spouse or whoever you're around, if this individual displays callous sexual attitudes towards women, in other words, that's objectifying statements, things that clearly demean women in some way. So harboring those kinds of attitudes, and those are easy to pick up on in just the normal discourse of talking to somebody. You can figure out that if they have these, that's a warning sign, right? And if this individual has a belief system where he thinks that violence, solving problems through violence, or being like aggressive in the sense that I'm going to be violent, I'll solve this problem with violence. If that person's belief is that corresponds to that's what makes a man, you got a problem. Okay, that's an issue. Okay, and then the experience of danger as exciting. So in other words, risk taking that is unrealistic. So if this individual is someone who engages in things that are clearly putting his life at risk, others' lives at risk, doing very reckless and things that are very dangerous, and he gets a rush from it and he enjoys it, that's a warning sign. That's another warning sign. Now some people they're thrill seekers. I get that. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that the base jumpers or people who like to jump out of airplanes, that's the experience of danger and that's exciting. That's not what I mean by that. It's engaging in things that clearly are high risk taking situations, doing things without thinking, carefully through them. You know, I don't have a good example, but you know, you can think of some things that men may do that are that later on, you know, they reflect back, you know, think, well, that was stupid. You know, they ended up, you know, playing Russian roulette, for example, would be, I guess, that would be an extreme version of this, but Russian roulette, you know, roulette. Hey, that's kind of dangerous. I don't know, Russian roulette, you know, so everyone probably hopefully knows what that is, but you know, you got one bullet in the chamber on a revolver with 6 rounds, and you just spin that chamber and, well, you know, if someone's doing stuff like that, you know, doing those kinds of things, I'd probably see that as a warning sign.
Yeah, I'm out the door.
Or they might just be suicidal, you know, so either way.
Well, that's another...
It's a concerning thing, yeah.
That's a whole nother red flag. Well, thank you so much for having this conversation with me today. We will have videos on YouTube, and you're welcome to interact with us and ask questions about this case. I'm sure it's going to produce a lot of commentary. So you can find us on Killer Psychologist on YouTube. Thanks for listening. Killer Psychologist video episodes are now on YouTube, and you can post your responses there. For episode details and merch, check out killerpsychologistpodcast.com. And for forensic services, you can book online at psychologydr.com. That's psychologydoctor.com.